Okay, so I'll just proceed to introduce the event. Just to say that as some of you already seem to be aware because you've messaged us in the Q&A, could you use the Q&A, please, to pose any questions? We'll have a chance for questions towards the end of the event. So as I say, I'm really delighted to welcome you here to this event with Polly Zavadivker, and it's an online book talk about her recently published book, A Nation of Refugees, Russia's Jews in World War One. And I think, these topics are so fascinating. So we already had a slight conversation that some of you may have heard about how maybe some of the resonances in terms of the significance of World War One perhaps play out differently in the United States than Europe. So that was interesting to hear about. We'll be hearing about the book, which is actually a 2024 National Jewish Book Award finalist. So really pleased we can hear more about this important work. And just to say that Polly Zavadivker is an associate professor of history and Jewish studies at the University of Delaware. And in addition to A Nation of Refugees, the book we're hearing about tonight, she's the editor and translator from Russian of the 1915 diary of S. Ansky, a Russian Jewish writer at the Eastern Front. And her articles and essays have appeared in Jewish Social Studies, the Simon Dubnow Institute Yearbook, and the multi-volume series, Russia's Great War and Revolution. So I'll hand over now to Polly to talk about the book and its themes, and I think she's got some slides to share with us as well. Polly.
Okay, thank you so much, Barbara. Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you online, the Wiener Library. I'm so honored to speak at this institution, which has been really important for me in my research and teaching. So thank you for hosting me. As Barbara said, I'm going to share some slides and show you the cover of my book to begin with. And hopefully that's visible to everyone. Yeah, so I published this book with Oxford University Press last fall. It was a labor of many, many years. It began as part of my dissertation research over 10 years ago. And I would like to walk you through the book today, share with you the main themes, how I went about trying to take a topic as big as World War I in Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire, and trying to distill it into a number of themes and topics and a geography across a very vast landmass empire. And I look forward to questions that you may have at the end and any kind of discussion. And of course, my email is here as well. So I encourage anyone to please be in touch with me after the talk. The cover, I should say a word about the cover, which as soon as I saw this painting, it's at the Jewish Museum and it's by Moricy Minkowski. It was a painting of 1910 called After the Pogrom. And although it was painted shortly before World War I felt it captured so perfectly the themes that I was exploring in the book. The experiences of displacement of civilians, of ordinary people, and especially of women and children. And the way that these Minkowski captured this image to me was just a snapshot of the book itself. So I was thrilled to find this image for the cover. So when we talk about World War I in Eastern Europe, so much more is known, as many of you may know, about World War I on the Western Front. But the subject of the Eastern Front had been, kind of considered forgotten. When we talk about the Eastern Front of the First World War, we're talking about a vast territory stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, covering what had been most of Western Russia, and for Jews, the Pale of Settlement, the zone of legal residence, where there and in Habsburg Galicia, which you see kind of in the shaded bottom left corner, Jews made up well over 6 million in population, roughly 10 to 12% of the total population. And this is where the front line ran. It was a front line of almost 2,000 miles. The militaries, the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, and the German militaries clashed across much of this space. It was a space of mass displacement, of forced migration, of military violence directed at civilians, and of popular violence, local neighbors taking part in some of that military violence. There was also the home front, St. Petersburg and Moscow. So I will talk about sort of how the geography figures into the story that I tell in the book, but I just wanted to give you a sense of where it takes place, and just the magnitude of the war's impact on East European Jewry. There were 15 million Jews worldwide. Roughly a third of them lived, or more than a third of them lived in Eastern Europe. This is the part of the geography in which the book takes place. The great cities of Vilnius and Warsaw and Kiev, but also many of the smaller towns there in the Pale and also in Galicia. One of the big challenges I faced when I began writing this book is I felt that the war was so important in setting off so many different types of trajectories, many of which culminated in World War II and in the Holocaust. But this quote by Hannah Arendt really encapsulated some of the issues that I was dealing with. And that the First World War, she wrote in Origins of Totalitarianism, touched off a chain reaction in which we, the post-war world, have been caught ever since, and which nobody seems to be able to stop. What I wanted to understand was, how did the First World War appear to the people who lived through it? We often read it, and scholars had read it in retrospect as the starting point for the period of the revolutionary era, the era of the nation state, or conversely, the war as this culmination of the long 19th century, the end of the imperial order, the collapse of great power politics as they had been for centuries. I wanted to understand really very discreetly the years between 1914 and 1918 in Eastern Europe, in which there was simultaneously a world war, two revolutions, and the start of a civil war. So that was the task that I set myself, just in terms of the chronology, really to understand the war not as a culmination of what came before, a catalyst for everything that followed, but really an event in its own right that affected civilians in a very specific kind of way. So as I mentioned, part of the challenge chronologically and geographically is that you had so many overlapping events. The way that the war straddled two eras, the era of empire and the era of the nation state and revolutionary society. Also the geography of the war, the way that the Russian Empire and its Jewish population, borders were redrawn around them in 1915, in 1917, in 1918, as armies advanced and occupied and withdrew. So this was again, some of these challenges that I faced in trying to figure out what is it that I really wanted to understand about how this military conflagration and this cataclysm affected the lives of ordinary people on the ground. So I'm going to show you a number of photographs from the book, and some photographs that didn't get into the book for various reasons, and walk you through the themes. I have three sort of interwoven themes of the book. And the first one was this moment of um, displacement and violence. This was a major factor in the determining how civilians experienced the war. So at the beginning of the war, because the front line broke out in this area that was densely populated with civilians, Jews, Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and so forth, um, many people fled from the front to seek safety further from the front in the interior or in bigger cities. So there was this mass dislocation just in the first days of the war that stretched into the fall of 1914. Um, Military occupation, military battles affected the territory. Um, and I tried to understand sort of what that was like from a person on the ground from their point of view. So, for example, in this period of the war, cities like Pinsk, which were larger, more urban type of shtetl in the Pale of Settlement, were overrun with refugees very early in the war. Um, it was a population with 75% of its residents were Jews, and refugees or displaced people. Technically, they were internally displaced, but they were referred to at the time as refugees. One of the first uses of that term in a widespread kind of way, and so that is the term I use in my book as well. But the effect of the refugees arriving in Pinsk was that the town, despite having a great network of welfare and social welfare and a kind of safety net for its residents, as Jewish communities tended to have in the diaspora for centuries. That sort of communal autonomy was very, very prominent in Pinsk, but it was completely ill-equipped to absorb the needs of thousands of refugees, and later in the war, 1915 and 16, tens of thousands. And so this was a moment of crisis and adaptation and transformation at the level of the individual Jewish community, which recognized that in order to tend to the needs of people who were technically, in terms of the community, they were outsiders. They were from beyond the boundaries of the community. To tend to their needs, to create the kind of shelters, the kind of soup kitchens, the kind of medical care that was needed, there would have to be more systematic, centralized, and outside help. And so this dynamic plays out across the Russian Empire as Jews who are in a position to do that kind of work at the home front in Moscow and in Petrograd, the name of St. Petersburg during the war. They organized that type of help to bring to the Jews at the front. So that was very much a geographic dynamic, a home front, the Russian interior, and the front zone, people struggling in the areas of military occupation and battles. I write extensively in the first chapter about Warsaw. Warsaw, like Pinsk, was also a center for the absorption of refugees. Probably the largest number of refugees came to Warsaw by the fall of 1914. The numbers were constantly changing because people came and went, but as a result of flight and of military expulsions from surrounding towns, which I'll talk about more in just a minute, people came in the tens of thousands. By one estimate, about 70,000 Jews in Warsaw in November 1914. And again, you see, Jews arrived to the Gmina, to the communal administration, in need. And there had never been a need of this kind before. But I found very interestingly, and this is a second theme of the book, the response of Jews to these events in terms of philanthropy, in terms of organizing. There was incredible resilience and adaptation and a sort of expansion of existing services But again, nothing on the level that was, they were completely unprepared for the situation of that magnitude. So coming back to the theme of violence, a major aspect of Jewish civilian experience during World War I was displacement and forced migration. So this is a map from the book. This is the subject of the second chapter. And I trace there what historian Eric Lohr has called one of the most significant cases of forced migration in Europe prior to World War II. So estimate very rough because lack of census data, lack of ability to measure movement of people on that scale. Between 500,000 and 1 million internally displaced Jews. They were among millions more refugees and displaced people in the Russian Empire from this region. But the cause of the displacement of Jews was very much related to factors involving xenophobic military policy directed specifically at Jews, specifically this fear that Jews were subversive, incapable of patriotism, spying for the enemy, all of these tropes of modern anti-Semitism. One observer described it as the blood libel had transformed itself into the espionage libel because just shortly before the war, there was the fresh memory of Mendel Bayless's trial. He was acquitted from the crime of so-called ritual murder in Kiev only in 1913, just a year before the war began. And so to people at the time, this espionage libel felt like a continuation of sorts of a form of anti-Semitism that targeted Jews as somehow a danger, a threat, in this case to the Russian military interests. And so these are some of the major paths of displacement from the Northern Pale, especially from what's now Lithuania and Latvia, northern Poland and northern Belarus. And then within Poland itself, a tremendous amount of displacement. As I mentioned, Warsaw, of refugee resettlement. But you can see one of the things that I really wanted to trace in the book that I had not been able to find information about in other studies was what happened to the deported, displaced refugees and migrants after the period of displacement. I wanted to understand, where did they resettle? Many of them were sent to this zone here in dark gray, what's now Eastern Ukraine. This was an official sort of government sanctioned area where Jews could be resettled beyond the area of strategic military importance. But also importantly, many Jews were deported as this area became overcrowded. They were sent further east, and in some cases as far east as Eastern Siberia. So there are cases of Jews resettling in cities like Tomsk and Irkutsk, major numbers of refugees resettling in Nizhny Novgorod as well. So again, this dynamic between what was done to Jews and how Jews responded was very interesting for me to trace across the entirety of the book. This is another aspect of violence and victimization, sadly very, very resonant for us right now. This is a photographic memorial from the YIVO archives to the Russian army practice of taking hostages among Jewish communities. This was a common military practice in many belligerent countries, but in this case, it was directed at Jews, again, out of this fear of spying and the belief that if certain elite, prominent, or wealthy members of a community were arrested and had to sign papers saying that they would be executed if any kind of treason was discovered in that community. This was the Russian army's way to try to impose fear and order in these communities. There were tens of thousands of hostages. People lived in fear of being taken hostage. And in this case, from these hostages were expelled from Radom and Kielce in Poland to Poltava, which was in that area of eastern Ukraine that I showed you on the previous map. And it's a unique artifact in that it captures the names of the men. But this was an experience documented in people's diaries, memoirs, of sitting in jail, and in some cases, when communities might be expelled on a whim of a local officer, in some cases the hostages would be killed. Pogroms, also a feature of military violence in the war. I tried to understand where they took place, what the military pogrom was like. It very much differed from pogroms of the pre-war era. Before the war, the Russian state, the Russian military, despite popular perceptions, had not been involved in organizing or perpetrating mob violence and riots against Jews. That was not the case during World War I. At the local level, soldiers who lacked discipline, officers who lacked discipline, engaged in this kind of anarchic violence, and it was to a very large extent tolerated by military authorities, in some cases encouraged. And so everywhere here you see the square was a site of a pogrom that I was able to document. So it's not exhaustive in terms of where the military perpetrated this violence against Jews. It's really just a sample of the documentation. But importantly, what I was able to find in terms of this dynamic is, if you look at this front line here, this is where the line between the Russian army, the German army, and the Austro-Hungarian army stood as of July 1915. Then, over the course of the summer, the Russian army suffered catastrophic defeats and was forced to withdraw several hundreds of miles and give up this territory that's now much of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Belarus. This northern part was occupied by the Germans, the German army, and part of the southern territory was retaken by the Austro-Hungarian army. And you can see where the line, when the dust finally settled and the Russian army stabilized the front line, this is the dotted line where the front stabilized in September. So you can see the territory between those two lines is where the pogroms were concentrated. And so it's a clear sign that the violence against Jews was very much correlated with and maybe determined by military retreat, demoralization, scorched earth policy that characterized those months of the summer months of 1915. And that is indeed what I found. Some of the worst pogroms took place during that time period. These are some of the atrocities that were documented. The destruction of Torah scrolls, the destruction of synagogues, destruction of Jewish life by the Russian army, very flagrantly sort of attacking Jews as Jews. I mentioned pogroms in the summer of 1915. This is a town called Samargon, now in Belarus. It's between Vilna and Minsk. And this was a town completely burned and destroyed and emptied of Jews and most of its other inhabitants as well in September of 1915. The journalist Daniel Charny, brother of Shmuel Niger, both important Yiddish writers before, during, and after the war, described refugees to ascribe to him that Samargon had been wiped from the face of the earth. And you see here, it was a very vibrant shtetl, an important leather trade, numerous factories and tanneries. The inhabitants fled as a result of a pogrom in September 1915 for Minsk, but much further from there as well. I found communities of Samargon people in Kharkiv, in what's now eastern Ukraine, in Nizhny Novgorod, along the Volga River, and elsewhere. And they really remained this kind of unit, retaining their identity of their hometown, and in many cases, their trade as well. And I'll show you some images of that later. So this emphasis, this theme of violence, it was unavoidable because it was such a determining aspect of civilian life in the Russian Empire during World War I. It was also the best documented aspect of the war. This is Simon Dubnov, such an important figure, great historian, political activist. And he was in Petrograd at the time of the war, very actively working to document atrocities against Jews, understanding that after the war, minority rights and the manner in which borders would be redrawn would significantly depend on the ability of different groups to provide an account of their sufferings and their wartime woes. And in order to make a claim in the post-war international sphere, diplomatically, records were necessary, documentation was necessary. And so it wasn't just him, but he was sort of at the center of all of these historians and lawyers and writers who were documenting the suffering and the tragedy of Jews as a result of military violence and popular violence and anti-Semitism during the war. And he produced, over the course of the war, something that was published in Russian called the Black Book of Russian Jewry. So books of different colors were used in prior wars and by different countries as ways to kind of as tokens in diplomacy. So for example, Armenians were able to document the British had their white books and blue books of atrocities against Armenians under Ottoman rule, and so on and so forth. So this was the idea at which Dubnov had when he titled the book that he edited, The Black Book of Russian Jewry. It was broken into sections covering pogroms, covering deportations, covering libel, covering the rape of Jewish women. So this is such an important sort of central document that so many scholars had relied on in their study of the war. So in that sense, violence really looms large in our understanding of how Jews experienced World War I. What I was finding, though, was a more complex story, not just about what was done to Jews, but also, again, the subjective experiences of Jews, how they responded, and what transformed among them socially, culturally, politically, as a result of these wartime tragedies. This was an important person for me as I was writing my book. Emmanuel Levinas is one of these books that I read of his during graduate school that just stuck with me and came back to me again and again and again. Levinas was himself a Russian Jew. He grew up in the city of Kovno. Russian-speaking family, highly educated. When he was about 10 years old, the city came under German military occupation. His family fled, and they resettled in Kharkiv, which, as I mentioned, was something of a center for Jewish refugees. And he later described in interviews toward the end of his life this moment of war, revolution, displacement. So he did not, this is an excerpt from the book, he did not suffer terribly. He continued to study Russian and other languages. The family didn't starve, no one died. But he really intimately came to know the experience of rupture, of displacement, of loss. When the family tried to return to Lithuania after the war, there was extremely hostile circumstances, very little prospects. Ukraine had been taken over by Bolsheviks by that point, so they fled Bolsheviks, then they fled from Lithuania, and he left for Paris in the early 1920s, never to return, of course. And this phrase of his that he remembered from the start of World War I, the troubles that appeared in 1914 never ended, as if the order had been forever disturbed. I kept coming back to that concept, the order had been disturbed. Not necessarily entirely for the bad, but how is it that people understood this breaking up of the order of things that they had grown up with? How did they respond to that? What was it like to live when institutions, home, the family, all were taking different trajectories simultaneously? So Levinas and this concept, this idea of the order being disturbed forever, was really what I was trying to understand from the subjective viewpoint of Jewish civilians. So aid work was a very, very important aspect of understanding how Jews responded to this changing order. The most important organization in Russia, based in Petrograd, it was founded by wealthy Jews and Jewish leaders, including Simon Dubnov, but the leader of the Jewish Committee for Aid to War Victims was Genrikh Slozberg. He'd been an important lawyer before the war. And you could consider these efforts to be practical nationalism through war relief. This was Jewish national work and Jewish relief work really conflated together. There was very little outside of war relief that occupied Jewish communal organizations at the time of the war. So one of my favorite aspects of researching the book was following the lives of these various relief workers, not just the leaders like Slozberg, but the people who were sent from the front to were sent from the home front to the front where Jewish civilians were living to try to help people on the ground. So, for example, Nochem Stief, he was a Yiddish writer. He was a scholar. He had a PhD and was had set out to be a lawyer before becoming a writer and a critic of Yiddish. The Yekopo, knowing he was originally from the Pale of Settlement, spoke Yiddish, he spoke Russian, he could move between these different worlds, and he was very much a Jewish nationalist. He wanted to help people at a very basic level. So he was in Petrograd at the start of the war, and they sent him to Vilna and surrounding towns to organize relief work in the surrounding shtetls, but also in Vilna. Ansky, a very, very famous figure during the war and as a Russian Jew as well. I had come to this project partly out of interest in his war diary, which, as Barbara said, I had translated from Russian. He too was a traveling relief worker, somewhat unusual for the time given his age. He was in his, I believe, 50s at this point. So quite a bit older by several decades than the average relief workers who were men and a few women in their 20s and 30s. But again, this combination of their Jewish nationalism, their cultural nationalism, and their efforts, that sense of urgency to help Jews, and this sense that the Jewish world was somehow breaking apart that they had known for centuries before, and that relief work could help to somehow salvage it and bring it, stabilize it. So one of the places that relief workers followed the refugees was far into the Russian interior. I had mentioned, for example, Nizhny Novgorod. This is a map from the book in which I show the numbers of people who settled in the various places. And you can really get a sense of sort of the centers of resettlement. Kharkiv, Saratov along the Volga, this Tambov, the city in the sort of Russia's Black Earth region, Nizhny Novgorod, important port city, but as far east as Tomsk and Irkutsk, And again, these numbers represent almost 100,000 Jewish refugees outside of the Pale of Settlement. So effectively, the Pale of Settlement ceased to exist, and you had Jews living without residence rights, even before the Russian Revolution abolished the residence restrictions. Nizhny Novgorod, very important for me. This was a city where I mentioned the refugees from Samarkand, many of them alighted. And what did they do? They formed Jewish schools, cheders, elementary, primary religious schools, yeshivas even, workers' co-ops and soup kitchens. And interestingly, from Samarkand, the leather, those who knew the leather industry and leather trade might have been drawn to Nizhny Novgorod because it too was a center for leather production. And so they managed to recreate in exile some of the leather industry that they had from their hometown, which was at this point completely destroyed. This is an example of how the refugees were tracked and the attempts of relief organizations to follow the refugees, understand who they were. Are they men? Are they women? What kind of needs do they have? Are they able to work? If they are able to work, can we create employment bureaus? It was really a holistic relief effort designed at sort of impacting every single aspect of a displaced person's life. Their culture, their children's education, the needs of single women, the needs of women who had become heads of household in the absence of their sons or fathers or husbands being conscripted. So this is an example from the archives of the YECOPO, the Jewish Committee for Aid to War Victims, of how exactly the attempt to organize a rational form of relief was conducted during the war. I mentioned Jewish culture. I showed you earlier the image of the Torah scrolls that were decimated. There was an effort of the Jewish Historical Ethnographic Society to travel around towns that were, after the Great Retreat, remained under Russian rule. So primarily in territories of Belarus, around Minsk, and a bit further south, Vitebsk provinces. And this man, Boris Rubinstein, who had been a director of the Jewish Museum in Vilna, and was himself a folklorist. He had worked with Ansky during the ethnographic expedition before the war. So he was tasked with going from town to town, collecting Torah scrolls, collecting valuable objects from synagogues, trying to preserve what he could of the material culture of Judaism so that it could be salvaged and recreated after the war. So one of the fascinating stories of Rubinstein is he arrives in this town of Druya now in Belarus. Almost 9 out of every 10 residents of Druya was a Jew, so small town. And as soon as he arrived, everyone knew he was there to try to rescue their Torah scrolls and rescue their valuable objects. What he really wanted and what the Historical Ethnographic Society had sent him there to do was to try to dismantle this wooden ark, the carved wooden ark of the Druya synagogue. And in order to protect it from damage during the war and to preserve it somewhere else, safely for the duration of the war, and then to return it. And you can see this is magnificent, one of the most stunning examples of the wooden carved arks of Eastern Europe. As soon as he arrived, and he tried to convince and persuade local people to dismantle this treasure of theirs, which had been theirs in the synagogue since the 18th century, they adamantly refused. And this was not the only place where he encountered resistance. Local people wanted to have agency over their sacred objects, including this ark. It was a very interesting sort of lesson for me, this insight into how people, again, the civilian perspective and the subjective experience of people facing displacement, even though the rational thing to do might have been to dismantle the ark, to give away the Torah scrolls for the duration of the war, people wanted to have these objects in their communities for their use. So it gave me insight into the civilian experience, the subjective experience of ordinary people. Here's another example of the Jewish almshouse. This was near Kovno province. So this was an area of mass deportation in spring and summer of 1915. And you have the elderly residents. And I just think it's fascinating to look into their faces and see what you interpret of their experience. Are they suffering? Are they dealing with the situation? They've been really just cast out onto the street and are being watched by what looks like, the local Christian population. So these were the stories, many of the stories that I try to tell in the book. I also was very interested in how refugees maintained cultural practices in very unforgiving circumstances. This is an image from the Leo Baeck Institute in New York. Jews at Prayer. They're wandering the roads. They've been either expelled or are fleeing for a safer place somewhere in Galicia. But nonetheless, they stop to pray. And the concept of anthropologists, Vina Das and Arthur Klein had studied this, how people remake their worlds, how displaced people remake their worlds was very, very important for me in tracing the responses of Jewish refugees to displacement, how they recreated synagogues and practices and rituals, even in these places where no Jews existed or there was no sort of thick culture or infrastructure for doing so. It's very, very fascinating. One of my most important accounts was called The Dust of War. It was a memoir written by a refugee from Lithuania by the name of Shimon Zev Eisenberg. So to share with you some of my sources, he wrote this in Yiddish after he had emigrated to South Africa from Eastern Europe. And it was one of the very, very few firsthand accounts of recorded by a refugee that I was able to see what it was like, the deportation, the search for refuge, being on trains, being on horse-drawn carts, falling ill, trying to survive. And this is conveyed in a very, very rare way in his memoir. This is the last sort of element of the book that I'll share with you, and then I'll stop for questions. But I was very interested to try to understand women's experiences and to sort of understand how they responded to the war in gender-specific ways and the types of violence and challenges and problems that they faced as women and as Jews and as Jewish women. I found that the way women were often represented was, beleaguered, suffering. This is an image from the Jewish press of a woman among a group of expelled Jews, probably somewhere meant to be somewhere around Warsaw, given the time period in which it was published. And so I found a lot of tropes representing women as sort of abandoned, on their own, women without men. And I think this had a very strategic purpose in terms of raising sympathy and mobilizing support for relief work, because it generated sympathy, but it also did not accurately represent the complexity of what women actually experienced. And so when I write about women, I write about the presence of male refugees who were so rarely recognized in any kinds of accounts. Sort of this idea that the men had all gone off to fight at the front or stayed behind to hold down the fort, so to speak. In fact, whole families were displaced together. Women and men had to endure the same types of hardships. Women were not alone. Rape was an experience that was completely silenced in later accounts. I had mentioned the Black Book edited by Dubnov. It contains a 4-page account written by the Bundist Genrich Ehrlich, Dubnov's son-in-law, of the rape of Jewish women. That is the only account we have from that time period that extensively and synthetically describes the experiences of women. Otherwise, it was completely silenced and overlooked and overshadowed, even though it was very much an aspect of the wartime pogroms. Women were in the public sphere very prominently as nurses, a few aid workers. Many of them did not leave accounts as their male counterparts did, so it was hard to find evidence of their participation in the war, but it was there. Here you have from the Jewish press an image of a school in Vilna, and you can see very clearly the teacher on the right. And this was a sort of model center that other regions copied, where children were brought. They had meals and structure and routine and learning, often in the native language of Yiddish. And so this was an example of how women were very, very active, if not always recognized as such, in providing this kind of stability, recreating the normalcy or attempt to recreate the normalcy of the lives and the Jewish lives that the children had known prior to displacement. Okay, I think I'll stop there. Really look forward to your questions. Happy to expand on any of the themes and images that I covered in the presentation, but thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Polly. That was really rich and fascinating. In a moment, I'll just put the discount code that we have for the book in the chat, but if anyone's got questions, if you put them in the Q&A, please. So I've got a couple of questions have come in already. So one from Francois Gonnet is, thank you for the presentation and saying the violence perpetrated by retreating Russian troops seems fairly systematic and sustained, and thus it departs from the pre-war patterns of spontaneous pogrom violence. Would you consider it helpful to differentiate the taxonomies, as in, should these be called massacres or pacification or retribution? Yes, so what's your view on that, Polly?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Thank you. The terminology is tricky. I chose to call these pogroms because they were first they were targeted at Jews, like the pre-war violence, even though they were perpetrated by the military and not spontaneous acts of popular violence. I felt it was important to draw that thread of continuity from before the war through the war, and also because following World War I, this type of pogrom, which you certainly could call them massacres, riots, and so forth, expanded exponentially in terms of the violence, the qualitative, quantitative violence during the Russian Civil War. And we refer to those as pogroms, right? I don't think there is, for ease of understanding the Civil War pogroms as an outgrowth of the First World War pogroms is very, very important, because they did set this model, a template, almost a blueprint for the military attacking civilians as such, which Jews had not been the target of such types of violence before. So I agree with you that they are different in their kind of structure and in terms of the perpetrators, but in their outcome, they have the same effects. And because, again, that drawing the importance of drawing that the continuity and changes in the pogrom over time, I think is important for terminology as well.
Okay, thank you. And then another question, which is actually sort of not so much to do with the issue of displaced people and so on, but actually about Jewish soldiers. And it's a question asking whether you have come across any documents or accounts of any issues sort of experienced by, for example, Jewish Russian soldiers if they were fighting against Jewish German or Austrian soldiers, or any kind of reflections that soldiers might have had on that particular issue.
Yeah, wonderful question. I didn't focus so much on Jewish soldiers. There is a wonderful book called, and it was a very important book for me, very foundational, by Simeon Golden, who's a historian at the Hebrew University. And he wrote his dissertation under Jonathan Frankel many years ago, and he published it as both Russian and English versions, a book called The Russian Army and the Jews. And so he focused very much on the experience of Jewish soldiers within the Russian army and the Russian army treatment of those soldiers. And we do have numerous accounts, some really interesting accounts of soldiers and what they experienced. There was this sort of legend, myth collected by people like Ansky in multiple places of this is the first time Jews are fighting in armies, right, against each other, right? The German Jews are fighting the Russian Jews, and the Habsburg Jews are fighting the Russian Jews as well. And there are these legends of a soldier killing another soldier, and a Jewish soldier killing another soldier, and hearing that soldier say Shema Yisrael as they perish, and then realizing they have killed a fellow Jew. And just to kind of, it becomes this embodiment of this terrible, the way that the war pits Jews against each other in these unintentional ways. So that's an experience that is encountered. There are also good studies of Jews in the German army, Jews in the Habsburg army. The Leo Baeck Institute has very good sources, and there are some secondary published sources on the experiences of German Jewish soldiers in Eastern Europe and how they experienced that encounter. But it's been studied to a lesser extent from the Russian side.
Thank you. And Fiona's wondering if you know how many Jews did serve in the Russian army.
Yeah, approximately 500,000 is the estimate. And it was estimated at the time that this was maybe 1 out of 3 Jewish men of working age. And this is one of the aspects of women's experiences that I thought was very important. So many of them became soldiers' wives. And so I looked at the changes in families dynamics and how women set about to care for their families in cases where their husbands had been conscripted.
Right, yes, thank you. So I'm just having a look, there are more questions there. So yes, if you've got any other questions, put them in the Q&A. I've shared the link to the book and the promotional code. I just wondered whether you had been able to use any archives actually in the kind of territories that you're talking about. So whether that's Russia and Ukraine, obviously there's issues there, or Belarus, or Lithuania, or Poland, or whatever.
Yeah, so I conducted the research before 2022. I was in archives in St. Petersburg. So much of the home front, the home front organization, the documents of the Jewish Committee for War Relief, the Jewish Historical Ethnographic Society. Those are in Russian, in archives in St. Petersburg. There are others in Moscow. A very large number of personal collections of Jewish politicians at the time of the war, people like Naftali Friedman and Mayor Bomash. They were Jewish representatives to the Duma. And they had among their papers, they had letters written from people, ordinary Jews, asking them for help people in front zones and who had been displaced or whose families had come under German occupation, for example. So those were very important for me, and many of those collections have also been microfilmed and copied and digitized by the U.S. Holocaust Museum. So that's another place I was able to find archival sources. The JDC archives were somewhat helpful, although in these years of 1914, 15, and 16, they were not working so extensively in Russian territories. They were on the German side of Poland. So that wasn't a territory that I examined in the book. I really was sort of, in principle, looking at what remained of the Russian Empire throughout the world. And also in Ukraine, I looked at archives in Kiev. I did not do deep dives or microhistorical studies into specific towns and places. I really tried to look at more of a survey of the empire as a whole.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. So a couple more questions have come in. So question again from Francois. He is saying that Nick Sayers in his recent The Jews of Lithuania argues that communal religious leaders deplored a notable drop in religious observance, presumably at this point, obviously during World War I. Can did your research confirm that perception that religious leaders had?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Where I found this was so I mentioned many of the refugees found themselves in the Russian interior, Far East. There were places with some presence of Jews who had lived there for maybe a few generations, but nothing of the infrastructure that they knew from home. And two really important Orthodox figures who dispatched representatives to study the conditions of the Jewish refugees outside of the Pale were Chaim Ozer-Grodzinski, the important figure of Lithuanian Jewry, and his Hasidic counterpart, Schneerson. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on which generation of Schneerson it was, but this was one generation before Menachem Mendel. So they chased down these refugees and were just completely outraged to see, for example, refugees sending their children to modern Jewish schools where they learned about Zionism, or they learned Yiddish but no Torah. So there was a real push on their part to offer alternatives, Orthodox alternatives, and you could say this is really a moment. The war is also this moment where Orthodoxy itself becomes quite politicized because of these transformations of Jews, and many of these taboos are broken on education, on where Jews can settle. Their opportunities completely change, and so Orthodox rabbis and figures are rightly, from their perspective, defending their own interests and trying to create these new sort of structures in the wartime circumstances.
Yes, thank you. And then just a question about conscription, actually. I think Fiona's commenting that one of the photographs showed men who maybe did look of fighting age. So obviously, men over a certain age or below a certain age wouldn't have got conscripted. But why were some men of fighting age not enlisted?
Yeah. Well, I can't speak for the photograph, for the people in the photograph. I don't know, but it was simply luck for some men. They weren't conscripted. They weren't called up. Some, had exemptions for military service, and some dodged the draft and refused to serve. So it was a combination of many different factors but I found that among the refugees, women did outnumber men in some areas, and in others were roughly equivalent in number to that of working age men.
Right, that's interesting. Yes. And then Fabio is saying that their grandfather came to London in I think it must be they must mean 1910 to prepare bringing his family, including the Fabio's 4-year-old father arriving in London in, I assume, 1914. How many refugees were able to kind of reach somewhere like England, you know, get further afield, not just be internally displaced, but get further away, perhaps from the front line once the war had started? Was that possible, really?
Yeah, very good question. So, yes, felicitous to have left shortly before the war, also because so many quotas, migration quotas, were put into place after the war. Um, it's a sort of understudied topic, the migration of Jews out of the Russian Empire did continue during the war, but in much, much reduced numbers. So the Jewish Colonization Association had been very, very active in facilitating migration out of Eastern Europe and in the Russian Empire before the war. And they continued their activities during the war. There was a port at Arkhangelsk on the Arctic Sea where they were able to send some ships out, but very, very small numbers. It was extremely difficult to leave the Russian Empire. And then there are also cases of people being smuggled across the border into the German and Austrian sides and sort of making their way west. But you know, again, the problem of studying people who moved illegally is just that, right? The lack of records. But there is anecdotal stories to that effect.
Okay, thank you. So I don't think we've got any more questions unless I've missed one. So yes, thank you so much, Polly. It was really fascinating talk, and thank you to the audience for great questions. And I hope that next time you're doing a talk, we'll be able to do it in person at the library. That would be great. But it was really good to have you all here online. As I say, there may be a version online. We may be posting a recording. You can look out for that on the Wiener Library's YouTube channel. And yes, look at our website, subscribe to our newsletter to find out about other events and exhibitions and various activities that we're involved in. So it just remains for me to thank Polly once again for a fantastic talk. Thank you all for coming, and we will see you all again at Wiener Library events.
Thank you so much.